The doctor didn't waste time trying to soften the truth. He stood beside my hospital bed with a tablet in one hand, and my hat scan glowing on the screen behind him. "Elowen, we need to operate today," he said. "This isn't something that can safely wait." My stomach still felt like it was being twisted from the inside out. Every breath sent another wave of pain through my body, but somehow his next sentence hurt even more. "Your insurance is temporarily denying the authorization because of an administrative issue. The hospital requires a $5,000 deposit before we can move forward." $5,000. I had saved, but not enough to cover that amount on such short notice. Most of what I'd managed to put away over the years had gone toward paying off student loans and finally buying my own small condo last spring. I stared at the ceiling and tried to think clearly, but fear has a way of making every thought collide with the next. "How long do I have?" I asked. The doctor hesitated for only a second. "A few hours. We can stabilize you for now, but I wouldn't recommend delaying much longer." He squeezed my shoulder before leaving. "Call whoever you trust." Whoever I trust. Those words should have had an obvious answer at 31 years old. Most people would call their parents without thinking twice. I wish I had been one of those people. Instead, I lay there staring at my phone, already knowing exactly how the conversation would go. "My name is Elowen Sloane, and if my family had believed me even once when I said something was wrong, my life would have been very different. Growing up, every scraped knee, every migraine, every panic attack, every problem somehow became evidence that I was too dramatic. That phrase followed me through childhood like my own shadow. Too dramatic, too sensitive, too emotional, too much. My younger brother, Landon, never had that problem. If he sneezed twice, my mother would make him soup. If I came home with a fever, my father would tell me to drink water and stop exaggerating. I learned very young that pain sounded different depending on which child was speaking. I unlocked my phone and called my father anyway. The line rang twice before he answered with his usual impatient tone. "Yeah." I swallowed hard. "Dad, I'm in the hospital." Silence. Not concerned silence, annoyed silence. "What happened now?" "The doctors found something serious. I need emergency surgery today. There's a problem with my insurance and I need $5,000 until everything clears. I'll pay it back as soon as the claim goes through." Another pause. Then I heard him sigh. "Elowen." My stomach tightened before he even finished the sentence. "You're 31 years old. You really need to stop turning every inconvenience into a catastrophe." "Dad, this isn't. You're being dramatic again." His voice stayed calm, almost bored. Somehow that hurt more than if he'd yelled. "The doctor said emergency surgery. Doctors always say everything's urgent. That's how hospitals make money." I closed my eyes. "Please, I'm asking for help because I don't have another option." "No, just one word, simple, final. Figure it out." The call ended. I stared at the dark screen until it reflected my own face back at me. Pale, sweating, scared. I wasn't even surprised. That's the worst part. My father had never actually believed me about anything important. I called my mother next. She answered after 4 rings. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice sounded softer than my father's, but I'd learned years ago that soft wasn't the same as supportive. "Mum, I need your help." I explained everything again, slower this time, hoping maybe hearing my voice would make it real. She listened quietly until I finished. Then she sighed. "Have you talked to your father?" I said no. Another silence. "Well," she began carefully, "you know how worried he gets when you jump to the worst case scenario." I almost laughed. "Mom, I'm lying in a hospital bed." "I know, honey. I just maybe wait a little longer. Maybe it's not as serious as it sounds." The surgeon said today. "Your father thinks you're overreacting." There it was again. Not what she believed. What my father believed. That had always been enough. "Do you?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. That silence told me everything. "I have to go," she finally whispered. "We'll talk later." The line disconnected. I stared at the phone again, wondering how 2 conversations could make a person feel so completely invisible. I should explain something. My parents weren't monsters in the obvious sense. They didn't scream every day. They didn't hit me. They simply decided very early in my life who I was, and nothing I did afterward ever changed their minds. Landon was dependable. I was emotional. Landon was rational. I was impulsive. Landon deserved patience. I needed correction. Those roles became permanent long before either of us was old enough to understand them. When I was 11, I broke my wrist falling from a tree. I remember crying because it hurt so badly I couldn't move my fingers. My father told me to stop making such a scene. We didn't go to urgent care until the next morning because he thought I was looking for attention. The doctor looked at the X-ray and asked why we'd waited so long. My father never apologized. He simply said, "Well, she usually exaggerates." That sentence somehow became part of my medical history inside my own family. When I was 16, I collapsed during gym class because of dehydration after a stomach virus. My mother told relatives I'd fainted because I skipped breakfast to be dramatic. When I developed migraines during college, my father insisted stress couldn't possibly hurt that much. Every experience taught me the same lesson. If I said something was wrong, they would assume I was wrong. Landon never experienced that. Once, he complained about chest pain after football practice. My parents rushed him straight to the emergency room. It turned out to be simple muscle strain. My father called it better safe than sorry. I remember wondering what it felt like to have someone believe your pain before asking for proof. I hadn't spoken to my parents much over the last few years. I had finally accepted that distance was healthier than constantly trying to earn approval that was never coming. I built my own life instead. I became a senior architectural designer. I bought my condo. I paid my bills on time. I never asked them for money. Never asked for favors. Never expected rescue, which made lying in that hospital bed, asking for help feel even more humiliating. I wasn't asking them to solve my life. I wasn't asking them to support me forever. I was asking for one bridge over one impossible day. My phone buzzed. For one brief second, hope flickered inside me. Maybe Dad had changed his mind. Maybe Mom had convinced him. Instead, it was a text from Landon. "Dad told us you're trying to borrow money again. You're 31, Ellie. Stop making every little problem sound like the end of the world." I read it twice before my vision blurred. He didn't even know why I was in the hospital. He hadn't asked. He simply believed the version of me our father had spent decades creating. I locked the phone without replying. A few minutes later, Dieter Brooks returned with a nurse beside him. His expression was gentle, but I recognized the seriousness in his eyes immediately. "Elowen," he said quietly, pulling a chair closer to my bed. "I need an answer soon. We don't have unlimited time." My hands trembled as I looked at the consent forms resting on the blanket across my lap. Outside my room, the hallway felt strangely quiet, almost suspended between ordinary hospital life and whatever was about to happen to mine. I took a shaky breath, picked up the pen, and wondered if I was about to sign away, my only chance to survive. I stared at the consent form until the words blurred together. The nurse standing beside me must have noticed, because she gently took the clipboard from my shaking hands. "You don't have to decide this second," she said. "But the sooner we know, the better we can prepare." I nodded even though I wasn't sure I understood anything she was saying anymore. My body hurt, but what terrified me most wasn't the pain. It was realizing that if I disappeared today, the people who were supposed to love me most had already decided I wasn't worth believing. While I sat alone in that hospital room, memories I hadn't thought about in years kept surfacing one after another, almost like my mind was trying to prove this wasn't really about $5,000. This had started decades earlier. I was 8 the first time I remember hearing my father laugh at me for saying something hurt. I'd fallen off my bicycle, scraped both knees, and twisted my ankle badly enough that I couldn't put weight on it. I cried because I honestly thought I'd broken something. Dad looked over from the garage and shook his head. "You're making it sound like your leg fell off." He carried my bike inside but told me to walk it off. 2 days later, when my ankle was still swollen, Mom quietly took me to urgent care while Dad was at work. The doctor said it wasn't broken, but the ligaments were badly strained. My father never apologized. Instead, he smiled and said, "Well, at least now she'll know the difference next time." There was always going to be a next time. There always was. Every headache became me seeking attention. Every stomach became anxiety. Every setback became another example of how dramatic Elowen could be. Meanwhile, Landon lived in a completely different universe. If he complained that school was stressful, my parents booked him an appointment with a counselor within the week. When he sprained his shoulder during baseball, my father drove across town twice in one day to make sure he had the best orthopedic specialist available. I wasn't jealous of him for receiving care. I was heartbroken that I had to fight for basic belief. By high school, I stopped telling my parents when I wasn't feeling well. It was easier to deal with things alone than to hear another lecture about resilience. Ironically, that independence became another reason they dismissed me. "You've always been fine on your own," my father liked to say whenever I actually needed help. The truth was, I had learned to survive without them because experience taught me I couldn't count on them. My phone buzzed again, pulling me back into the hospital room. Another text. This one came from my mother. "Your father is upset. Please don't keep pushing him today. He's under a lot of stress." I stared at the message for several seconds before a short, bitter laugh escaped me. I was lying in a hospital bed waiting for emergency surgery, and somehow the person whose feelings needed protecting was my father. I typed 3 different replies before deleting every one of them. Nothing I said would change the story they had already written about me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Dieter Brooks stepped back into the room carrying another folder. He sat beside me again. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I smiled weakly. "You mean emotionally or physically?" He returned a sympathetic smile. "Both? I've had better Tuesdays." He nodded, then became serious. "I want to explain exactly what's happening, because I don't want you thinking we're trying to pressure you. The inflammation is progressing faster than we'd hoped. Medication can slow it for a little while, but surgery is still the safest option." "If I can't pay today?" I asked quietly. He looked down before answering. "We'll continue treating your pain and monitoring you, but delaying significantly increases the risk of complications." I appreciated his honesty. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was respecting me enough to tell me the truth. That simple act felt strangely unfamiliar. I thanked him after he left, then lay back against the pillow and closed my eyes. I had spent so much of my life trying to become someone my family would finally believe. I earned scholarships, graduated near the top of my class, built a successful career without asking anyone for favors, bought my own home, never borrowed money, never called in the middle of the night, never expected them to rescue me. Yet the first time in years I truly needed help, they responded exactly as they always had, as if my greatest flaw wasn't bad luck or poor judgment. It was simply being me. Another memory surfaced. I was 23, working my first real job after college. I developed pneumonia, but thought it was just a lingering cold because I'd been taught not to trust my own body. I kept going to work until I collapsed in the office parking lot. My manager insisted on taking me to urgent care. When I called my parents afterward, hoping maybe this one time they'd say they were worried, my father laughed lightly and said, "See, if you'd stopped panicking earlier, maybe you wouldn't have worn yourself out." Even genuine illness somehow became evidence that I had overreacted. Looking back, I realized something that hurt almost as much as my condition. I had started doubting myself because they doubted me. Every symptom became a negotiation inside my own mind. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this isn't serious. Maybe I'm wasting everyone's time. If the pain hadn't become unbearable that morning, I might have convinced myself to stay home. That thought sent a chill through me. How many other people had been taught to distrust their own instincts by the people who were supposed to protect them? Around noon, the nurse returned carrying a small paper cup filled with medication. "Any family on the way?" she asked kindly. I hesitated before answering. "I don't think so," She gave me a look that was full of compassion without crossing into pity. Sometimes family surprises us. I wanted to believe that. I really did, but experience had taught me otherwise. Another hour passed. My pain worsened despite the medication. Every few minutes I glanced toward the door, hating myself for still hoping someone might walk through it. Maybe Mom would come without telling Dad. Maybe Landon would realize this wasn't a joke. Maybe one of them would finally choose me over the version of me they'd invented years ago. My phone rang unexpectedly. My heart jumped. Dad. I answered immediately. Dad? I forgot to ask, he said flatly. How much exactly are you asking for? Relief rushed through me so quickly I almost cried. 5,000, just until the insurance clears. I already talked to billing. They'll refund everything once the claim. He interrupted me. $5,000 because your stomach hurts. My hope vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It's not stomach pain. It's emergency surgery. He sighed loudly enough for me to hear. You're unbelievable. Then someone in the background laughed. I recognized Landon's voice. Tell her to stop Googling symptoms, he joked. My father chuckled before speaking into the phone again. We're not financing another one of your dramatic episodes. Click. The line went dead. This time I didn't cry. Something inside me simply went quiet. Whatever tiny part of me had still believed my family might surprise me finally gave up. 15 minutes later, the billing coordinator entered my room with an apologetic expression. Ms. Sloane, she said softly. If we don't receive confirmation soon, we'll have to release today's operating room slot. I nodded because I couldn't trust myself to speak. She left the room, closing the door gently behind her. I looked toward the window as rain began tapping softly against the glass. Somewhere beyond that grey sky, people were living ordinary lives, making ordinary decisions, believing ordinary phone calls from the people they loved. I wondered what that felt like. Just as I reached for the clipboard again, determined to sign whatever papers were necessary, someone knocked firmly on my door. It wasn't the hesitant knock of a nurse or the quick tap of a doctor. It sounded deliberate, confident. Before I could answer, the door slowly opened, and a woman I hadn't seen in almost 9 years stepped into the room. The woman standing in the doorway looked almost exactly the way I remembered her, except her dark hair now carried thin silver streaks around the temples that somehow made her seem even stronger. She wore a navy trench coat, still damp from the rain, and carried a leather satchel over one shoulder. For a moment, I honestly wondered if the pain medication was making me hallucinate. "Oh, Vivian," I whispered. She smiled sadly. "Hello." Ellie. Nobody had called me Ellie in nearly a decade. My parents stopped using that nickname after Vivian disappeared from family gatherings, almost as if saying it reminded them she had ever existed. I pushed myself upright despite the pain. "Ho? How did you know I was here?" She crossed the room and gently squeezed my hand before answering. "One of the charge nurses is the daughter of an old friend. She recognized your last name when you came in and remembered I'd once asked her to let me know if anything serious ever happened to you." I stared at her. "You ask someone to watch out for me?" She nodded. "A long time ago." Before I could ask another question, she glanced at the clipboard on my bed. "The nurse told me you were about to lose your operating room because of a payment issue." I felt embarrassed all over again. "It's complicated." "No," she said quietly. "It's actually very simple." She opened her satchel, took out her phone, and looked at me. "How much?" I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to say the number out loud again. $5,000 had already cost me what little faith I still had in my family. 5,000. She didn't blink. She simply opened her banking app. "Give me the hospital's billing information." I thought I had misunderstood. "Vivian?" "Helly." She looked directly into my eyes. "I'm not asking whether you've earned the help. I'm asking where to send the money." My throat tightened so quickly I couldn't answer. Tears blurred my vision before I even realized I was crying. She reached over and brushed one away with the same gentle kindness I remembered from childhood. "You don't have to apologize for needing help." 20 minutes later. The billing office confirmed the payment had cleared. I watched the coordinator smile for the first time since I'd been admitted. "We'll notify the surgical team immediately." The moment she left, I turned back toward Vivian. "I don't know how to thank you." She shook her head. "You can thank me by getting through surgery. I'll pay you back. We'll argue about that another day." I laughed softly through my tears. "You always hated losing arguments." "I still do." For the first time since arriving at the hospital, I felt my chest loosen just a little. It wasn't because the surgery suddenly seemed less frightening. It was because someone had finally believed me without demanding proof first. As nurses began preparing me for the operating room, Vivian stayed beside the bed answering questions the medical staff asked that I could barely focus on. She listened carefully when Dr. Brooks reviewed the procedure, asking practical questions about recovery, medication, and follow-up appointments that my own parents should have been asking. At one point the doctor looked at her and asked, "Are you her next of kin?" Vivian hesitated only briefly. "Family," she answered. "That's enough for today, Jer." Brooks nodded without questioning it. While a nurse adjusted my EV, I looked at Vivian again. "I thought you never wanted anything to do with us." Her expression softened. "I never wanted anything to do with your father." That answer stayed with me. It was different from everything I'd been told growing up. According to my parents, Vivian had abandoned the family after becoming greedy over money left by my grandparents. They described her as bitter, selfish, impossible to please. Yet the woman sitting beside my hospital bed didn't resemble that story at all. She looked tired from driving through the rain, but completely certain she belonged there. "Dad always said you left because of the inheritance," I murmured. A faint smile crossed her face, though there was no humor in it. "Of course he did." Before I could ask what she meant, 2 nurses arrived with my paperwork. "We're ready for you," one of them said. Suddenly everything became very real. They transferred me onto a rolling bed. Bright hallway lights passed above me as they wheeled me toward the operating suite. Vivian walked beside me the entire way, never once letting go of my hand until the doors marked authorized personnel only came into view. She stopped there because she had to. I looked at her one last time. "What if something goes wrong?" I asked quietly. She squeezed my fingers. "Then you'll know someone showed up." Those 6 words broke something open inside me. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. She had shown up. My parents hadn't. The doors closed between us. The anesthesiologist introduced himself while monitors were attached to my chest. Everything happened quickly after that. Someone adjusted the oxygen mask over my face. Another nurse asked me to confirm my name and date of birth one last time. Gster. Brooks leaned over me before they started. "We're going to take good care of you." I nodded weakly. "Please don't let me die." His eyes held mine. "That's the plan." The medication entered my EV. The ceiling lights stretched into soft white circles. Then everything disappeared. I don't know how long the surgery lasted, because the next thing I remember was hearing muffled voices somewhere nearby. My throat felt dry. My body felt impossibly heavy. I blinked several times before realizing I was in recovery. The first face I saw wasn't my mother's. It wasn't my father's. It wasn't Landon's. It was Vivian's. She looked exhausted. But the moment she realized I was awake, relief flooded across her face. "Hey," she whispered. "Welcome back." My voice barely worked. "Did it?" She smiled through tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed until then. "The surgery went well." I closed my eyes in gratitude. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. I simply listened to the quiet rhythm of the heart monitor beside me, grateful that it was still there. Later that evening, Dr. Brooks returned carrying my chart. His expression was different this time, more serious. He pulled a chair close to the bed and looked first at me, then at Vivian. "I need both of you to understand something," he began. "The procedure was successful, but the findings confirmed something we were already concerned about." My stomach tightened despite the pain medication. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands carefully before answering. "Based on what we found, delaying this operation much longer would have been extremely dangerous." The room fell completely silent. Then he looked directly at me and said words that would change everything I believed about my family and everything they had insisted about me for my entire life. Elowen, you weren't overreacting. You were much closer to dying than anyone realized. I thought hearing that I had almost died would make me angry first. Instead, I felt strangely calm. For years I had questioned my own instincts because my family questioned them. I had spent most of my adult life wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I really did overreact. Maybe I really was too emotional. Maybe every pain felt bigger because something inside me was broken. Dieter Brooks had erased all of those doubts with one sentence. It wasn't in my head, it never had been. After he left, the room stayed quiet for a long time. Vivian sat beside the bed reading through the discharge information while I watched the rain slide slowly down the window. Finally I broke the silence. Did they call? She looked up from the papers. Ho, I almost laughed. Exactly, she hesitated before answering. No, not once. That answer hurt less than I expected. Maybe because somewhere between my father hanging up on me and waking up after surgery, something inside me had finally stopped waiting for them to become different people. Over the next 2 days my recovery was slower than anyone hoped. Sitting up felt like climbing a mountain. Walking to the bathroom left me exhausted. Vivian stayed through all of it. Every morning she arrived before breakfast carrying fresh clothes, a book, and coffee she never managed to finish because she spent more time talking with nurses than drinking it. She learned the names of every person taking care of me. She asked thoughtful questions about medication schedules. She made sure I ate even when I insisted I wasn't hungry. She did all of it so naturally that none of it felt performative. She simply acted like someone who loved me. On the third morning, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me since she arrived. Why did you really leave? Vivian looked out the window before answering. Because I couldn't keep pretending your father was a good man. I frowned. Dad always said you left because you wanted Grandma's money. She smiled sadly. Your father has always been very talented at rewriting history. I waited. She took a slow breath. Do you remember falling through the ice when you were 9? I blinked. At first I only remembered fragments. Snow, a frozen pond behind a neighbor's property, the shock of freezing water, barely. You and Landon were playing outside while your parents were visiting friends. I nodded slowly. I remember being cold. Vivian looked down at her hands. You weren't supposed to be near the pond. The ice broke under you. More memories surfaced. The terror, water filling my boots, the sound of someone shouting. Dad pulled me out. No. I looked at her in confusion. What? Your father wasn't even outside. She held my eyes. I was. My heartbeat quickened. No. Victor didn't know you'd fallen in until I came running back carrying you. My mind refused to accept it. That wasn't how I remembered the story. My father had always told relatives he'd rescued me himself. He even joked about how careless I'd been. Vivian continued quietly. I was visiting your mother that afternoon. I looked out the kitchen window and saw you disappear into the water. I ran before anyone else realized what had happened. I stared at her. Why would Dad lie? Because admitting he hadn't been paying attention would have made him look irresponsible. She paused. Because people praise heroes. I felt sick in an entirely different way. You're sure? She reached into her bag and removed an old photograph protected inside a plastic sleeve. It showed me wrapped in a blanket, soaked from head to toe. Vivian was kneeling beside me. A paramedic stood nearby. My father wasn't anywhere in the picture. Your grandmother took this before the ambulance left, she said softly. She kept it. My hands trembled as I held the faded photograph. All these years I had remembered the event through stories my father told afterward. Stories that apparently weren't true. Mom knew, I whispered. Vivian nodded slowly. She knew? She never said anything. She rarely challenged your father. I looked back at the photograph again. A memory returned with startling clarity. I remembered waking up wrapped in a heavy blanket while someone rubbed warmth back into my hands. I had always assumed it was my mother. Now I realized the sleeves in my memory were dark blue. exactly like the coat Vivian still wore today. That wasn't the only time, she said quietly. There were other moments when Victor decided protecting his image mattered more than protecting you. I felt something inside me begin to rearrange itself. It wasn't just one emergency. It wasn't just one phone call from a hospital bed. My father had spent decades creating a version of reality where he was always reasonable and I was always difficult. The terrifying part was how many of us had believed him, including me. Later that afternoon, while Vivian went downstairs to speak with the billing department, my phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it, assuming it would be another automated hospital message. Instead, I saw Landon's name. Dad says you're telling people he refused to help you. That's not fair. He just didn't think it was an emergency. I read the message several times. There was no, "How are you?" No, "Did the surgery go well?" Just another defense of our father. I finally replied with 6 words. The surgeon said I almost died. He didn't answer. Not that day. Not the next one either. On the morning I was discharged, Dr. Brooks stopped by one final time. He reviewed my recovery instructions, then hesitated as though debating whether to say something else. "Can I ask you a personal question?" he said. "Sure." "When you first arrived, you apologized repeatedly for taking up our time." I looked down. "Did I?" "Several times." He folded his arms. "People who exaggerate illness usually insist they're dying before we've examined them. You kept apologizing for asking for help even after we confirmed you needed emergency surgery." I didn't know what to say. He smiled kindly. "Whoever convinced you that needing help is something to apologize for?" He let the sentence trail off before shaking his head. "I hope one day you stop believing them." After he left, I sat silently for a long time. I wasn't thinking about the operation anymore. I wasn't thinking about the $5,000 either. I was thinking about every version of my childhood I had accepted without question, every story my father had told, every apology I'd made for being sick, every time I'd ignored my own instincts because someone else insisted they knew my body better than I did. Vivian walked back into the room, carrying my discharge papers and car keys. "Ready to go home?" she asked. I looked at her and quietly answered, "I don't think I know where home is anymore." She gave me a gentle smile. "Then come stay with me until you figure it out." As we walked slowly toward the hospital exit, I noticed 2 familiar figures standing near the reception desk. My mother and father. They hadn't come to see how I was doing. They hadn't come while I was unconscious. They hadn't come during recovery. But judging by the expression on my father's face as he stared directly at Vivian, they had come because they had just learned exactly who had paid for my surgery. I froze the moment I saw them. My father stood with his arms crossed, wearing the same expression he always wore whenever he believed someone had embarrassed him. My mother stood half a step behind him, nervously twisting the strap of her purse between her fingers. Neither of them looked relieved that I had survived. They looked irritated. Vivian noticed them a second before I did. She quietly stepped closer to me without saying a word. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't confrontational, it was simply protective. My father walked toward us first. "Well," he said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "Looks like you're alive after all." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Maybe "I'm glad you're okay." Maybe I was worried. Maybe even a simple "How are you feeling?" Nothing came. Instead, he looked directly at Vivian. "So you're the one who decided to encourage all this?" Vivian didn't flinch. "Or what?" "This performance." My father gestured vaguely toward the hospital behind us. "You always had a talent for making Elowen think every inconvenience was a crisis." For a moment I honestly wondered whether he believed his own words or had simply repeated them so many times they had become reality inside his mind. Vivian remained calm. "The surgeon disagreed with you. Doctors exaggerate to protect themselves." He shrugged. "She would have been fine." My chest tightened. Even after everything, even after a successful operation, he still couldn't admit he'd been wrong. Dr. Brooks had shown me scans. He had explained exactly what would have happened if we'd waited. Yet my father preferred to argue with facts rather than with his own pride. My mother finally spoke. "Victor?" she whispered. "Maybe this isn't the place?" He ignored her completely. "You know what really bothers me," he continued, looking back at me. "Instead of handling this privately, now half the family knows we didn't send you money." I blinked. "That's what you're upset about? People are talking?" He looked genuinely offended. "Do you realize how this makes us look?" I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because his priorities were so perfectly predictable they had become absurd. I had nearly died. He was worried about gossip. Vivian stepped between us before I could answer. "She doesn't owe you an apology for surviving." My father narrowed his eyes. "This is between me and my daughter. It stopped being just between you two when you left her to face emergency surgery alone." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. My father took one slow step toward Vivian. "You don't know the whole story." Vivian met his stare without hesitation. "I know exactly what happened." He scoffed. "Really? Better than you'd like." My mother touched his arm. "Let's just go," but he shook her off. "No, she's been waiting years for a chance to make me the villain." Vivian's expression didn't change. "Victor, you became that without my help." My father turned away first. "Come on," he muttered to my mother. "We're done here." They walked toward the parking lot without another word. My mother glanced back only once. Our eyes met for barely a second before she looked away again. It struck me that she hadn't asked whether I was in pain either. During the drive to Vivian's house, neither of us spoke very much. I leaned my head against the passenger window, exhausted from standing for less than 10 minutes. Recovery felt slower than I expected, but emotionally I was changing much faster than physically. Every mile away from the hospital also felt like another mile away from the version of myself that had spent years begging my family to believe me. Vivian lived in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by old maple trees. Her house wasn't large, but it felt warm in a way my parents' house never had. Framed photographs lined the hallway, shelves overflowed with books. A sleepy golden retriever lazily wagged his tail when we walked inside. "His name is Murphy," she smiled. "He'll think you're here specifically to pet him." Murphy immediately rested his head against my leg, as if welcoming me home. I hadn't even unpacked my overnight bag before Vivian insisted I lie down in the guest room. "Doctor's orders," she said. "Technically, those are your orders." I'm borrowing his authority. Over the next week, my life settled into a routine I hadn't realized I needed. Physical therapy exercises in the morning. Short walks around Vivian's backyard in the afternoon. Movies in the evening. She never hovered, but she was always nearby. She knocked before entering my room. She asked instead of assuming. Every small kindness highlighted just how little kindness I'd accepted as normal. One evening, while we were eating dinner, I asked the question that had been bothering me since leaving the hospital. "Why did you ask someone to call you if something happened to me?" Vivian set her fork down. "Because I knew your father." "You really thought he'd do this?" She looked at me sadly. "I hoped I was wrong." "When did you realize?" She sighed quietly. "Years ago." I waited. "The day you graduated college." I frowned. "What happened?" "You don't remember." I shook my head. Vivian smiled sadly. "Your father spent the entire reception talking about Landon's baseball scholarship." I searched my memory. She was right. I'd thought it was strange at the time, but I'd convinced myself I was being sensitive. "When people congratulated you?" Vivian continued. "Redirected every conversation back to your brother." My stomach tightened. "I thought I imagined that." "You didn't." She looked directly at me. "Ellie, that's what worries me most. How often you've been taught to doubt yourself." I looked down at my plate without answering. The truth was painful because it was accurate. 2 days later, I felt well enough to check my work email for the first time. My manager had already arranged medical leave and assured me my projects were covered. There was also a message from Human Resources wishing me a smooth recovery. Complete strangers had shown me more compassion in 1 week than my own father had in 31 years. Then another notification appeared. It was from my cousin Rachel. We weren't especially close, but we occasionally exchanged holiday messages. I heard you had surgery. Are you okay? Uncle Victor said it turned out to be something minor after all. I stared at the screen. Something minor. Even now he was rewriting the story, not only refusing responsibility, but actively minimizing what had happened. I showed the message to Vivian. She read it slowly before quietly setting the phone back on the table. He started telling people before you even left the hospital. Why? I asked. Because if people believe this was minor, then refusing to help sounds reasonable. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly understanding something important. My father wasn't just protecting his reputation anymore. He was building a version of events that erased his guilt before anyone could question him. Vivian looked thoughtful for several seconds. Then she stood, walked into her office, and returned carrying a small notebook. She opened it to a blank page. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Writing down dates." "Why?" She clicked her pen. "Because memories fade. Documents don't." I watched as she carefully wrote the date of my admission, the time my father refused to help, the time payment was made, the surgeon's diagnosis, and the confirmed medical findings after the operation. She wasn't plotting revenge. She wasn't trying to destroy anyone. She was preserving the truth before someone else rewrote it. When she finished, she closed the notebook and looked at me. "Your father has spent his entire life depending on people forgetting the details." I frowned. "What if nobody asks?" Vivian gave me a calm, knowing smile. "Eventually, someone always does." I spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding my strength one careful step at a time. Recovery wasn't dramatic. It wasn't inspirational. It was frustrating. Some mornings I could walk around Vivian's neighborhood without much trouble. Other mornings I needed to sit down halfway through making breakfast because my body reminded me it had been through something serious. Every time I became impatient with myself, Vivian would quietly say, "Healing isn't a race." It was probably the healthiest sentence anyone had ever spoken to me. Growing up, everything had been measured by how quickly I recovered, how little help I needed, how quietly I suffered. Rest had always been mistaken for weakness. Asking for help had always been treated like failure. Living with Vivian slowly taught me another possibility. One afternoon my phone buzzed while I was organizing paperwork from the hospital. The caller had surprised me. It was my mother. I stared at the screen until it almost stopped ringing before finally answering. "Hello." There was a long silence before she spoke. "How are you feeling?" It should have been a comforting question. Instead, it sounded rehearsed, almost like someone reminding themselves of the correct thing to say. "I'm getting better." "That's good." Another silence. "Your father?" She stopped herself. I waited. "Your father thinks things have gotten out of hand." I couldn't help smiling bitterly. "Because I almost died." "Because people are talking." Of course. It always came back to that. "Mum," I said, "did he ever ask if the surgery was successful?" She didn't answer. "Did he ask what the doctors found?" Still nothing. "Did either of you wonder why I would risk my life by pretending?" I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. "Your father just—" "No," I interrupted gently. "I'm asking you." The silence stretched so long I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally she whispered, "I don't know anymore." That sentence stayed with me after we ended the call. For the first time in my life, my mother sounded uncertain about my father. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an admission that he'd been wrong, but it was a crack in the certainty she'd hidden behind for decades. 2 days later Vivian invited me into her home office. The room smelled faintly of old books and cedar wood. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer carefully labeled. She placed a large accordion folder on the desk between us. "Take a look." Inside were copies of everything connected to my hospitalization. The emergency room report, the surgeon's notes, the billing records showing exactly when payment had been made, my insurance approval that arrived less than 48 hours after the operation, proving the $5,000 truly had only been a temporary requirement. Every document was organized chronologically. "You've been collecting all of this?" I asked. "Yes." "Why?" She leaned back in her chair. "Because your father has already started rewriting the story." She handed me several printed screenshots. They were messages relatives had forwarded to her. One came from my cousin Rachel, another from Uncle Dennis, a third from someone I barely knew. Different people, same version of events. Elowen scared everyone over a routine procedure. Victor wanted to wait for a second opinion. Vivian rushed in and created unnecessary family drama. I looked up slowly. He's telling everyone this. Vivian nodded. He's getting ahead of the truth. I felt my stomach tighten. Shouldn't we correct them? She folded her hands together calmly. Not yet. Why not? Because arguing with rumors only creates more rumors. She pointed toward the folder. Facts are patient. I sat quietly for a moment. You're planning something? She smiled faintly. I'm planning to tell the truth. Those aren't the same thing. Not always. She stood and walked toward the window overlooking the backyard. Victor depends on private conversations, half-finished stories, selective memories. If we chase every lie, we'll spend years doing it. She turned back toward me. Sometimes the truth needs the right room. I wasn't entirely sure what she meant, but I trusted her judgment more than I trusted my own at that point. A week later I returned to work on a reduced schedule. My co-workers welcomed me back with far more kindness than I'd expected. No one questioned whether I had really been sick. No one accused me of exaggerating. They simply asked how I was feeling and adjusted deadlines until I fully recovered. It was such an ordinary display of empathy that it almost felt foreign. During lunch, my manager stopped by my desk. "Take it easy," she said. "Projects can wait." I smiled. "Thank you," she shrugged. "Health comes first." I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 simple words. Health comes first. Somewhere along the way I'd grown up believing family reputation came first. My father's comfort came first. Landon's happiness came first. Keeping the peace came first. My own health had somehow ended up near the bottom of the list. That evening, as I was leaving the office, I noticed 3 missed calls from Landon. I debated ignoring them before finally calling back. He answered almost immediately. "Hey." His voice sounded unusually hesitant. "Hey, can we talk?" I waited. "About what?" "Everything." I leaned against my car without saying anything. He sighed. "Dad said your surgery wasn't really an emergency. The surgeon disagrees?" "I know." That caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Mom showed me part of your discharge paperwork." He paused. I didn't know. I closed my eyes briefly. "You never asked." "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry." It was the first apology anyone in my immediate family had ever offered me, without attaching a condition to it. But before I could respond, he continued. "Dad says Aunt Vivian is turning everyone against him." There it was. The apology still couldn't exist without our father's influence. "Landon," I said quietly, "did Dad ever tell you why Vivian stopped coming around?" "Because she fought over Grandpa's money." "That's not true." Silence. "How do you know?" "Because she showed me proof." He didn't answer. I continued. "You've spent your whole life hearing one version of every story." Another long pause followed. Finally he said, "Dad's organizing the annual family reunion next month." "Okay." "Everyone's coming." I didn't understand why he was telling me this until his next sentence. "He wants everyone to see that nothing happened." After we hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes thinking about those words. Nothing happened. My father honestly believed that if enough time passed, people would forget. They would stop asking questions. His version would become the only version left. When I walked into Vivian's house that evening, she looked up from the dining table, where several folders were spread neatly across the surface. Without looking surprised, she asked, "Did Landon tell you about the reunion?" I blinked. "How did you know?" She smiled knowingly. "Because your cousin Rachel called an hour ago." She slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It was an invitation to the annual Sloane family gathering. My father's name was printed proudly across the bottom as host. I looked up. "Are we going?" Vivian slowly closed the folder in front of her. "Oh," she said calmly. "I think it's finally time your father tells his story in front of everyone." The invitation sat on Vivian's dining table for 3 days before either of us touched it again. Every time I walked past it, I felt the same knot tighten in my stomach. Part of me wanted to throw it away and pretend none of those people existed anymore. Another part wanted to walk into that room and ask every question I'd spent my entire life swallowing. Vivian never pressured me. She simply let the decision become mine. Finally, 2 nights before the reunion, I carried the envelope into the kitchen where she was making tea. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted. She looked up with a calm smile. "You're not going there to fight. Then why am I going?" She poured hot water into 2 mugs before answering. "To stop hiding from a story that was never yours to carry." I sat across from her, thinking about those words. For years I'd avoided family gatherings because they exhausted me. Every conversation somehow ended with someone praising Landon or reminding me that I needed to lighten up. Every achievement of mine became an opportunity for my father to explain why I was still too emotional, too sensitive, too intense. Leaving those gatherings always felt like escaping a room where everyone spoke a language I couldn't understand. "What if nobody believes me?" I asked quietly. Vivian slid 1 mug toward me. "Then you walk away knowing you told the truth." She paused before adding, "But I think you're underestimating something." "What?" "People have been noticing more than your father realizes." Saturday arrived faster than I expected. The reunion was held at a country clubhouse my grandparents had rented every summer for decades before they passed away. My father continued the tradition because it allowed him to play the role he loved most, the respected head of the family. As Vivian and I walked toward the entrance, I could already hear laughter drifting from inside. Children ran across the lawn chasing each other, while older relatives stood in small groups catching up over iced tea. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, almost beautiful. It struck me how easy it was for painful families to appear happy from the outside. We hadn't even reached the main entrance before my cousin Rachel hurried toward us. She hugged me carefully. "I'm so glad you're okay." "Thank you." She stepped back and lowered her voice. "You look much better than Uncle Victor said." I frowned. "What did he say?" She hesitated. "That you had a minor procedure and got overly emotional afterward because of the medication." I exchanged a quick glance with Vivian. There it was again. Another version of reality, another carefully edited story. We walked inside together. The room was filled with familiar faces I hadn't seen in months, some in years. Conversations slowed as people noticed me. A few smiled warmly. Others looked confused, probably trying to reconcile my presence with whatever version of events they'd already heard. My mother spotted me first. She stood so quickly her chair nearly tipped backward. "Elowen." She hurried over and wrapped her arms around me before I had time to react. It was the first unsolicited hug she'd given me in years. "I'm so glad you're feeling better." I hugged her back politely but without the emotion she seemed to expect. "Thank you." She looked as though she wanted to say something else, but before she could, my father approached. "There you are." His smile looked polished enough to belong in a political campaign. "Everyone's been asking about you." "Really?" I asked. "Of course." He placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "I told them not to worry." Thankfully, it turned out to be nothing too serious. I looked directly into his eyes. "That's not what the surgeon said." His smile flickered for just a second before returning. "Doctors like dramatic language." I didn't answer. There was no point. Vivian quietly stepped beside me, and my father's expression hardened almost immediately. "Vivian." "Victor." The 2 of them exchanged polite greetings that carried decades of resentment beneath the surface. Lunch began a few minutes later. Nearly 30 relatives filled the long banquet room. My father moved easily from table to table, greeting everyone with practiced confidence. Watching him laugh with cousins and uncles who admired him felt surreal. They weren't seeing the man who had hung up on his daughter while she begged for emergency surgery. They were seeing the version he'd carefully built over many years. Halfway through the meal, he tapped a spoon against his glass. The room gradually became quiet. "I'd like to thank everyone for coming," he began. "Family has always meant everything to me." I felt Vivian's eyes shift toward him. This year has reminded us how important it is not to panic when life throws unexpected challenges our way. Several relatives nodded politely. Sometimes situations sound much worse than they really are. Thankfully, everything worked out in the end. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't mentioning my name because he didn't have to. He was planting one final version of the story before anyone else could speak. Then he smiled toward me. "Isn't that right, Elowen?" Every face in the room turned toward me. For a moment I considered simply nodding and letting it go. That would have been the old me. The girl who apologized for making other people uncomfortable. The woman who doubted her own memories whenever someone spoke confidently enough. Before I could respond, Vivian calmly stood from her chair. "Actually," she said, her voice steady enough to silence the room without raising it, "there are a few things I'd like to clarify." My father laughed lightly. "Vivian, this really isn't the time." "Think it's exactly the time." She picked up the leather folder she'd brought with her and walked to the front of the room. The same folder I'd watched her organize over the past several weeks. She placed it gently on the table beside my father's untouched coffee cup. His smile disappeared completely. "What are you doing?" he asked. Vivian ignored the question. Instead, she looked around the room at every member of our family before speaking. "For the past month, many of you have heard different versions of what happened to Elowen." Several people exchanged uncertain glances. My father took a step toward her. "That's enough." She opened the folder anyway. Inside were neatly organized copies of hospital records, billing documents, physician statements, and printed timelines. Every page was labeled, every date highlighted, every fact impossible to dismiss as emotion or exaggeration. She lifted the first document into the air. "Before anyone decides what they believe," she said calmly, "I think everyone deserves to hear what actually happened." The room became so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner above us. My father reached for the folder, but Vivian gently closed it before he could touch anything. Then she looked directly at him and spoke 7 words that drained every bit of color from his face. "Victor. This time, facts are going to speak." Nobody moved. My father stood frozen beside the head table while Vivian calmly removed the first document from the folder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply began reading. On March 14th at 10:42 a.m., Elowen Sloane was admitted to St. Matthew's Medical Center with severe abdominal pain. She held up the emergency room report. At 11:18 a.m., the attending surgeon determined emergency surgery was necessary. My father finally found his voice. "Vivian, this is ridiculous," she continued as though he hadn't spoken. 11:31 a.m. Elowen called her father requesting temporary financial assistance because her insurance authorization had been delayed. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vivian lifted another page. 11:47 a.m. Hospital billing confirmed no payment had been received. She looked directly at my father before continuing. At 12:26 p.m., I transferred $5,000 directly to the hospital. The operating room was released immediately afterward. My father stepped forward. "You're making it sound like she was dying." Vivian quietly handed another document to my cousin Rachel. "Would you mind reading the highlighted sentence?" Rachel looked confused but accepted the paper. After a few seconds her expression changed completely. She swallowed hard before reading aloud. "Further delay in surgical intervention would have placed the patient at significant risk of life-threatening complications." The room fell silent again. Vivian nodded. "Thank you." My father laughed nervously. "Doctors always use legal language." "Then perhaps the surgeon himself is also using legal language," Vivian replied. Before my father could answer, Dr. Brooks' signed statement was placed on the table. It confirmed exactly what he had told me after surgery. The condition had been far more serious than anyone initially realized. Waiting several more hours could have been fatal. My Uncle Dennis slowly removed his glasses and reread the document. "Victor," he said quietly, "did you know she needed emergency surgery?" My father crossed his arms. "I knew what she told me," Vivian answered before anyone else could. "No. You knew what the surgeon told her." Because she repeated it to you over the phone. She picked up another sheet. This is the hospital call log showing exactly when those conversations happened. My father opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. For the first time in my life, I watched him realize that confidence couldn't defeat evidence. My mother began crying quietly beside him. She covered her face with both hands. "I should have gone," she whispered. "I should have gone." Nobody answered her. Landon stared at the paperwork in front of him, as though it belonged to someone else's family. Finally he looked at me. "You really thought you were going to die?" I met his eyes. Yes, his shoulders slumped. "And I told you to stop making everything about yourself." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Ellie." There was no excuse attached to the apology this time. No mention of Dad, no attempt to soften what he'd done, just regret. My father looked around the room, desperately searching for someone willing to defend him. No one spoke. My Aunt Carol finally broke the silence. "Victor, why didn't you at least go to the hospital?" He looked at her in disbelief. "Because she exaggerates everything, even after all the documents, even after every piece of evidence, even after the surgeon's statement." He still couldn't let go of the story he'd built. Uncle Dennis slowly shook his head. "Not this time." "How do you know?" my father snapped. Dennis quietly tapped the medical report. "Because unlike your opinion, this comes from people who actually treated her." Another cousin spoke up. "You told us it was a routine procedure." Someone else added, "You said she scared everyone for no reason." Rachel looked directly at him. "You lied." My father straightened his jacket as though appearance still mattered. "I protected this family." Vivian looked at him with genuine sadness rather than anger. "No, Victor." She paused. "You protected your image." Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. My father looked around one final time, but every familiar face now held disappointment instead of admiration. The respect he had spent decades carefully collecting disappeared in a single afternoon. Not because anyone attacked him, but because the truth finally occupied the same room as his lies. He quietly picked up his car keys. "That's what everyone wants to believe." Nobody stopped him. He walked out alone. The heavy dining room doors closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any argument. My mother remained seated, crying silently. After several minutes, she stood and walked toward me. "I failed you." Her voice barely carried across the room. "Every time he dismissed you." I told myself keeping the peace was the kinder choice. She wiped away another tear. "It wasn't." I didn't answer immediately. I'd imagined this moment so many times over the years, but now that it had arrived, I realized I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I was looking for honesty. "I needed you to believe me," I said quietly. "Not fix everything. Just believe me." She nodded through tears. "I know." She reached for my hand but stopped halfway, waiting to see if I'd pull away. I didn't. I let her hold it for a moment. Not because everything was forgiven, because healing and reconciliation are different things. Landon joined us a few moments later. "I'm starting therapy next week," he said unexpectedly. I looked at him in surprise. He gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I think I've spent my whole life learning how to become Dad." He glanced toward the empty doorway where our father had disappeared. "I don't want that anymore." Months passed. My recovery continued. I returned to work full-time. I began hiking again. I laughed more easily than I had in years. My mother and I slowly rebuilt a careful relationship, one honest conversation at a time. Landon kept his promise about therapy, and for the first time since childhood, we started talking as brother and sister instead of competitors. My father never apologized. Instead, he gradually stopped attending family gatherings after realizing people no longer accepted his version of events without question. The strange thing was that I eventually stopped thinking about whether he regretted what happened. His regret wasn't necessary for my healing. Vivian and I grew closer than either of us expected. Sunday dinners became our tradition. Murphy still insisted on greeting me at the front door as though I had never left. One evening, almost a year after my surgery, I asked Vivian whether she had planned everything from the beginning. She smiled over the rim of her coffee mug. No. Then why keep every document? She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because people like your father count on memories fading. She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Truth deserves better than memory. Looking back now, I don't think the greatest karma was watching my father's reputation collapse. It was realizing I no longer needed his approval to know my own worth. For most of my life, I believed being loved meant convincing people that my pain was real. Now I know real love doesn't ask you to prove you're hurting before it decides to care. The people who truly belong in your life won't call you dramatic when you're asking for help. They'll simply show up. And if someone had dismissed your pain the way my family dismissed mine, I'd genuinely like to know one thing. Would you have ever been able to forgive them? A little over 2 years have passed since the day I lay in that hospital bed, convinced I might never leave it. Sometimes I still catch myself touching the faint scar on my abdomen when I'm deep in thought. It isn't a reminder of the surgery anymore. It's a reminder that surviving changed far more than my health. It changed the way I measure love. I used to believe family meant enduring anything. I thought loyalty meant staying silent when people hurt you. I believed that if I just worked harder, achieved more, or became easier to love, one day my father would finally look at me the way he looked at Landon. That day never came. Strangely, once I accepted that, I stopped feeling empty. My life became lighter because I was no longer chasing something that had never truly been mine to earn. My relationship with my mother continues to grow, slowly and carefully. We meet for lunch once or twice a month, and for the first time in my life our conversations are honest. She no longer defends my father. Instead, she talks openly about how fear kept her silent for too many years. I don't excuse what she did, but I can see that regret has changed her in ways excuses never could. Landon is different too. Therapy didn't magically fix everything, but it taught him to question the stories he'd been raised to believe. Sometimes he'll call just to ask how I'm doing, and every now and then he'll laugh and say, "I can't believe I used to think Dad was always right." Those moments remind me that people can change when they're willing to face uncomfortable truths. As for my father, we've spoken only a handful of times since the reunion. Every conversation has been polite, distant, and brief. He has never apologized. Maybe he never will. Years ago, that thought would have broken my heart. Today, it doesn't keep me awake at night. Forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing, and I've learned that protecting your peace doesn't make you cruel, it makes you healthy. Vivian is still the person I call first whenever life throws something unexpected my way. Every Sunday we cook dinner together, argue about recipes, let Murphy beg for scraps he definitely doesn't need, and laugh far more than either of us used to. She once told me that family isn't defined by who shares your last name. It's defined by who shows up when your world falls apart. I didn't fully understand that sentence until the day she walked into my hospital room, carrying nothing more than a rain-soaked coat and a willingness to help. Looking back, the $5,000 was never the real story. Money can be repaid. Trust cannot. The greatest gift Vivian gave me wasn't paying for my surgery. She reminded me that my pain deserved to be believed. She gave me back something my family had quietly taken away over many years: the confidence to trust my own voice. Today, whenever someone tells me something hurts, I believe them first, because I know what it feels like when no one does. And if there's one thing I hope people remember from my story, it's this. Sometimes the people who save your life aren't the ones you expected. They're simply the ones who choose to show up when everyone else walks away. So if you were in my place, would you have forgiven your family, or would you have closed that chapter for good?